Everybody, it's Eugene Lee Show, and welcome to this is episode 51 of Forensics Talks. Last week I had my 50th episode, which was quite a big deal. Like I say, if you do 50 of anything, it's a lot. So don't forget, we are live streaming to YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn. So you're more than welcome to watch on whatever platform that you're comfortable with. And also, we have a chat window. So in that chat window, if you have questions for our guest today, if you have any comments, by all means, put them in there. And I'm going to do my best to try and get to it and then present any of these good questions to our guest. Now, before we get started, there's just a couple things that I'd like to go over. And one of them is the IAFSM conference. So that's coming up here in February 14th to 18th. That's in Denver, Colorado. And if you go to iafsm.org, you'll be able to give that a look over. This is, they're doing like a mass casualty scene, and there's a whole number of participants, police agencies and such like that. There's a lot of 3D documentation as well. There's also the basic laser scanner certification course, which I will be teaching. And so if you're interested in doing something like that, definitely have a look here, and then we'll go from there. The other thing that I want to bring to your attention is the Forensic Photography Symposium. That's January 17th to 20th, 2022. And so if you are using a digital camera to document evidence, whether that is in a crash or crime scene scenario, then this is a symposium for you. So I've got experts globally from around the world, and they're all coming together to really talk about some very specific issues related to photography and digital imaging. And so if you go over to the website, just go down to like schedule. There is a schedule up. This is a tentative schedule. There's another one that's going to be coming up with some even more detail and some other presenters that have been confirmed. So, but this will give you a sense of the type of speakers that are already there. Also, if you want to learn about these speakers, what I've done is I've placed a whole bunch of speaker trailers up on the website. And again, they're just talking a little bit regarding their topics and what they're going to be covering. And I've also got some backgrounds here for the different speakers. Again, we've gone for people all over the world. So whether it's Belgium, the Netherlands, the UK, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, there's a whole bunch of different people. So please keep that in mind. And you can just go over to the website, ai2-3d.com/FPS. Okay, well, we're going to get started. My guest today is Andrew Fredericks, and I've known Andrew actually for years now. I guess I can actually say years. It's been some time. And Andrew is a certified forensic video analyst, and he's the co-founder and CEO and technical director for Input Ace. And if you don't know what Input Ace is, it's basically a video evidence software package that's used by law enforcement agencies worldwide for really interrogating video evidence, whether it's from CCTV cameras or from a number of different sources. And Andrew directs the development, training, and support for Input Ace, and he continues to do forensic video analysis casework throughout North America and abroad. Andrew specializes in decoding proprietary video file formats, video workflow automation, and conducting 3D laser scanning reverse projection. And Andrew also teaches these methodologies to thousands of police investigators and forensic video analysts every year. He's held some of his own symposiums. You can find some of his materials online. I'll make sure to post some of that into the comments. And he's a regular at a lot of conferences as well. Now, as a forensic video analyst, Andrew's been qualified as an expert and has testified in various courts in the USA and Canada. And that's something that we are going to be speaking to today. So let me bring him in here. Andrew, hey, how you doing today?
Yeah, doing well, Eugene. Thanks for having me.
Hey, excellent. Yeah, I really appreciate you're here. And like I said, yeah, I'm thinking back to the day when we first bumped into each other. I think we were in the hallway at a conference somewhere, and I don't remember where, but maybe a SPAR conference.
I was thinking that too when you pulled up the IAFSM ad. That well before they split off from SPAR was the first time that I met you and the others in that community back when it was really, really small.
Right on. So, well, let me talk to you about the beginning. So sometimes there's a lot of students that will watch this and other people who are not very familiar with becoming a video analyst. And in fact, it's something in schools, for example, at the university where I teach, it's something that's not really covered. There's no course on it or anything like that. So can you sort of just talk briefly about sort of what your path was getting into this particular area?
Yeah, so it is a fairly small field. There's a lot of peripheral uses of video evidence that expand well beyond the forensic video world, which is a very small community. every investigator now touches video evidence, right? So there's many different paths that lead their way into this realm. Many of those pass through certification programs. So the IAI and LEVA. LEVA is the one that has more of a training focus. So their certification program is pretty rigorous. It's 4 separate weeks, each of which are 40-hour classes, plus additional training that has to be to go through. So I think it's a grand total of like 250 some odd hours.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end, the really challenging process is to take a real case that you've worked yourself, full report to completion, and then you effectively go through a moot court testimony process where a panel of peers who are certified video analysts grill you on different topics about your report. One of them is often Jonathan Hack, who you had on your show, who comes more from the legal side. So you'll be heading up questions on the legal end as well as the more technical side. So a lot of people that get into this field start by diving right into something like LEVA. That's really how I got my start. My father actually was in the field, who you also had on your show, actually. So he worked as a forensic video analyst for a private organization. I started working there, started doing my training through that, and then fractured off into what became Input Ace as a separate organization about 6 or so years ago.
Yeah. Okay. Leva's, I mean, Leva's really well known. Jonathan Hack also is. I've heard some excellent reviews about his expert witness testimony course. So
that's fantastic.
Yeah. So if anyone is interested, look up Jonathan Q Hack, and he's got a bunch of courses there. So
he has a blog as well too that dives pretty deep into some of these topics. It's
yes. In fact, some of the stuff we're going to talk about today, actually, Jonathan had posted up on his website, like the Rittenhouse trial and stuff like that. So yeah, we'll get there. We'll get there. Let me ask you about how well informed people are with respect to video edits. So let's start, for example, with people maybe that are not technical. So let's say like the lawyers, judges, defense lawyers, crown attorneys, stuff like that. In your experience at trials and that sort of thing, how aware are some of these people with respect to the nuances of video that we are going to discuss?
Not at all, to put it bluntly, not at all. I think a lot of people, lay people, including attorneys and jurors for that matter, and judges, they often have an assumption that they know what's going on within a video. And it's really our duty as forensic video experts to kind of unravel that and show that what you may be seeing may not exactly be what is occurring. People tend to have inferences about what they're watching because they're so used to watching things like YouTube right now or Netflix. And in those scenarios, you typically, what you see is what you get. And in the CCTV world, it's not typically that easy.
Do you think it's just because everybody has, their camera phone, they take videos, their family and stuff like that? They're like, I got a video. I know exactly what I'm looking at. You think it's maybe that has something to do with it, or?
I think that's a big part of it. Another part of it is that they will also expect more from the video than can actually be brought out of it, right? Like a comment just popped in here about people watching too many CSI shows. There's even a term for that. We call it the CSI effect, where jurors will expect to get that kind of evidence. And then when it doesn't come, they then diminish their value that they attribute to the video. So it's really our duty to start kind of from square one and educate them about what's the technical nuances, and then put that lens over them when they're looking at the video.
Yeah. What about the people who are actually going to recover this video? So a lot of the law enforcement agencies and police agencies, investigators, detectives, whatever, they're going to be pulling this video. How well informed are some of these agencies? And I realize there's going to be some discrepancy here because it depends on where you're talking. But have you noticed a difference over the years, like where people are better informed? Is it getting worse, or what? What do you think?
I think it's beginning to get a little bit better. It still has a long way to go. Most people, until they take a proper training class, again, are going to assume certain things about the video and about the proper handling of the video. So a good example, someone goes out to a scene of an incident, they recover the video, and that person may not be trained in proper recovery techniques. So they are going to go to the DVR system, or the digital video recording device, and they'll push a bunch of buttons trying to get the file out. And what they may not realize is that act right there at the beginning of the acquisition process can lead to misinterpretation of the video down the line if they collect the wrong source of video. From that point, even putting it into the wrong playback solution or transcoding or converting. Transcoding is a fancier word I'll just say converting for the majority of the audience here. That process can also change the nature of the video and can certainly change how it's interpreted in the courtroom. There's actually a case out of your backyard that highlights this really well that happened just a couple of years ago. The final verdict came out, I think, within the last year in Ottawa, where a internal investigator recovered the video, made some mistakes in how they had performed that act, and that ultimately led to video being misinterpreted by several people on the prosecution team.
Right.
So that kind of thing is quite common. It is getting better slowly as we, it was one of our primary motives and things that we do in our organization is to provide training to investigators around the world to give them that kind of base level knowledge that they cannot make those mistakes when they're handling video before it hits a forensic expert's desk.
Right. So in thinking about the sort of our conversation today, I mean, I have some questions and that sort of thing, but in terms of the flow, I was thinking about the recording aspect. So like recording and recovery, which you just touched on, and then also the playback and review. So like what an expert might do after in the end. And then I also want to talk about trial, like when you're bringing video into trial. So let me ask you a question about recording. And just for the benefit of the audience, can you describe the typical way that a DVR or a camera will record what it sees?
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple of many different types of technologies out there. The most common when you're talking about your typical 7-Eleven or hotel, the environments that have a lot of CCTV cameras, even your street cameras, they're going to fall into two general buckets. One is going to be analog cameras that are sending a physical cable that goes and plugs into the back of a device. And the other is a digital camera that is transmitting the signal, whether to the cloud or to a networked video recording device. They're pretty similar in the end. I mean, the process ultimately is a sequence of events that starts with the lens of the camera effectively capturing light in the environment. So light comes through the lens, strikes a device that's behind the lens, and then that signal is converted into an electrical signal that then passes to the DVR. That electrical signal is then sampled, and it is then converted into binary ones and zeros digital data. And that process, I've simplified that quite a bit, obviously, and there's multiple different types that go along that flow, but the general process of light getting converted into electricity, getting converted into ones and zeros is pretty much as general as you can get.
Right.
Now, that ones and zeros process, that really is the crux of the whole thing. We're not in the analog world today anymore where we've got VHS tapes. And back then it was analog. It was, frequencies of light going to frequencies of electricity, getting burned on as literal frequencies on the tape. And there's not so much a dramatic transition from that to some other medium. But in the digital world now, we're taking that frequency-based signal and converting it into ones and zeros and compressing it. And that process of compression and conversion into binary information can cause a lot of challenges and can dramatically change the appearance of the data.
Right. And so compression was actually the next word I was going to talk to you about. So that's a good segue. And that what I want to, for people's benefit here, let's talk about why DVRs or why some systems will compress video. Like why would we compress video? What's the benefit and what's the danger of compression?
Well, compression is going to be inherent in almost every recording device that you've ever encountered. Now, you personally, maybe not, because you deal with some high-end, high-speed cameras and that kind of thing, which may not be dealing with the same amount of, or any, for that matter, compression. But every other device that a typical consumer interacts with, whether we're talking a cell phone or a body-worn camera or a general surveillance camera system, those are all compressed. And the purpose of compression is simply to save space on the device. There's no other reason for it. You can think about the pixels in an image, which I'm kind of jumping around a bit here, but every discrete little area of an image, little square-shaped color value inside of a digital image, that takes data to represent that color value at that location. So if I had an image that was 1920 pixels by 1080 pixels, that's many, many thousands of pixels. And if every one of them costs data to store it, if I then capture 30 frames per second, 30 times that 1920 by 1080, and then I maybe have 16 cameras plugged into a DVR, you can now see the math here of how many pixels times how much time times how many cameras are going to be recorded 24/7, and it will fill up a hard drive very, very quickly. So compression is a process of reducing the size of that data through a couple of different methods.
Right. And actually, I was going to ask, so there are, let's say, two basic methods that are very common in terms of compression. And could you just quickly cover those two?
Yeah, very generally. I mean, there's thousands of different
Right.
codecs and that kind of thing, but hundreds of codecs, but thousands of formats that we encounter. But the two big buckets that I'll call, one is spatial compression and one is temporal. And temporal compression is a method I'll give the example I like to use often is if you picture a camera system recording a white wall in the background, like behind me, if this were perfectly white, for example, and if I had just 10 pixels total, just as an example, every single frame of video is going to cost 10 pixels in size, which I'll ignore the actual size for now and just refer to it as pixel size. So if it's 10 pixels per frame, what temporal compression does is over time reduce the amount of data that it has to be stored, because the second frame will look to the first frame and say, what's changed? And if the first frame was 10 white pixels and the second frame was 10 white pixels, nothing has changed. So rather than store 10 pixels and then 10 pixels again, and et cetera, the second and third and subsequent frames will simply copy the data that hasn't been changed. And in that very simplified example I just gave, that's a perfectly appropriate form of compression. There's no degradation to the quality of the video. You still have 10 white pixels all the way through. It just costs less size to store it. Mm-hmm. The problem comes in a lot of the encoding mechanisms is that they will not get a perfect replica of what occurred at that moment in time. It will say, for example, if frame 2 was supposed to look like X and an earlier frame looked a little bit different than X, it will sometimes copy that and replicate it exactly as it looked earlier. And you'll lose some of that difference that should have been there.
Right.
And that's a bit of a simplified specific example. There's many like that, but the general premise here is that sometimes things will be held in place that shouldn't be held in place. There's a case example that we use quite frequently where a vehicle is driving through a scene and it's present at the very first frame of video when it enters the scene, and it just is held there and is continued to be held there as the vehicle continues to move forward. And those are it's not encoding errors exactly, it's just the format of how the compression was done in that device.
Right. On the playback side, so for example, when you play back video, what are some of the issues that, so somebody receives a video and they're gonna play it on their computer. What are some of the issues, or what are some of the things that people need to pay attention to that could cause them issues?
Yeah, so there are a lot of them, and sometimes they are not very obvious. So, for example, these DVR systems that are creating thousands of different formats that you can't play on a typical like Windows Media Player or VLC, those DVR systems will often misread their own video. So even playing that file inside of the manufacturer's own tool can lead to things like dropped frames of video, stretched shapes, changed color values. I mean, you name it. So those are typically the things that we would look for, is to ensure that we're getting all the frames, that we're playing them at the right size and at the right speed. And there are problems that can arise in all of those. I'd mentioned that case out of Ottawa, and that's a really great example. If we have time here, I might actually, I've got it on my screen. I can pull it up for you if that would help.
You know what? Why don't we do that right now? Actually, do you mind if I could do the screen sharing thing here, and let's talk about this Ottawa case. And actually, I'm going to paste this. This is from your website as well, but I thought it was a good resource. So I'm going to put this into the comments, and folks, if you want to, Andrew's going to present it now, but you can always go to the Impetus website and you can find some additional information there.
Great. And I know that not everybody will be watching the video of this. They may be seeing or hearing this rather as a podcast. So I'll try to describe what I'm showing here as best I can.
Sure.
So what I've pulled up right now is a MP4 file that was created by the internal investigator on this case. I'm actually going to pop this out and go full screen here. So bear with me 1 second. And in this recovery that the investigator pulled, what you're looking at right now are two officers, one here and one here, who are engaging this individual who's just off camera. This individual was assaulting some people that were off camera over here. Police are called to the scene. He then kind of enters in from stage right, and the fight is now on. Officers are engaged. They'll lead to a arrest here in a moment that you'll watch. And sometime after, about 5 or 10 minutes after this takedown event that you'll watch, the individual dies not far from the scene. So that is a process that will immediately trigger an internal investigation. And the internal investigators in this case arrived on scene, recovered this video, and it was a .psf file. And that's what I'm showing right here. This is the PSF file from that case. But the PSF file, although it comes with a proprietary player, when you export that from the DVR device, there's 2 files that came out, the PSF file and the proprietary player. So what one would assume is that that is the right way to play the file. And the investigator plays the file in that player. And then in order to create a standard MP4 file, he records his screen, which is another very common process. And then he sends that off to the pathologist and to the attorney. And what the pathologist watches is this event right here, 2, 1, bang. And he assesses that event, which he describes as the head slamming against the concrete here, bang. He describes that as the event that precipitated the cause of the individual's death. The head injury, bang.
Right.
And we can see that, right? It appears. Now, many people watching this may have a skeptical eye, and I've already alluded to the fact that sometimes video can be misinterpreted. So you all probably are a bit primed to recognize that there's something not right about this. There's something fishy going on here. And in fact, that is correct. What happened is the proprietary player, in conjunction with the screen capturing process, dropped frames of video during that critical event. And in fact, it dropped frames of video throughout the whole thing. But what that leads to, when you have a sequence of events and then you remove frames from that sequence and then you play it at the same speed, everything now looks accelerated. And so instead of seeing the events at the speed that they should have been played at, we're now looking at the events and not getting an accurate representation of timing. So what I'm doing right now is I pulled the original video file now. This is the PSF file with all of its 12 streams of video. We can see the date time is pulled out here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to play this forward in real time, starting right here. That's the speed of the takedown.
Yeah. Big difference.
Very, very different. And this is the kind of thing that can lead to misinterpretations about what event causes whatever it is that's being caused. In this particular case, the individual, the officer right here, was put on trial for homicide for that event. And without I'm leaving my forensic video cap on, all we look at are the specific facts and the specific questions that are being asked as it relates to the events. And in this particular case, that event right there of the takedown is obviously very different than what was being purported by the prosecution. Yep. Other events that may have occurred and other officers that were on scene doing whatever it was that they did is not in the purview of what I would speak to. Right.
And there was, well, this became a huge issue at trial, right? And I mean, the judge ruled on this and talked about the, and actually Grant, your father actually testified in this particular case in Ottawa. And so, actually on the link that I provided there, if you go there, there's actually the judge's ruling, and it is quite interesting to read. So if any of you are interested further in following up on this case, it's a really good point, and more information on that at that link that I sent you. Eventually I want to get to the, well, we're talking cases, so let's talk about another very popular case more recently. I've got to get to this eventually. So the other day I watched the Kyle Rittenhouse, some of the trial and sort of preparation for this talk. And so there's a video on YouTube. If you're interested, just search for it. Just look for Rittenhouse pinch and zoom. And that's it's almost comical, but it's a reality of sort of what's happening in the court system today. And it had to do, at least the part that I wrote, that I saw had to do with, you're on your phone or something like that, and you pick up an image or a video and you zoom in. And what is the effect of interpolation, of zooming in? And I guess there are a couple of different points here. And so Maybe Andrew, I don't know if you want to cover some of that. You guys did a blog post here, which is on your website. Yeah. And what I'm going to do is, as you're speaking, I'm going to put in that link into the chat window as well.
Yeah, so I expected that we were going to go here, so I had this link kind of ready. This is a very common question that comes up. Now, maybe not specifically about iPhone and pinching, right, but about resizing in general. Very common that people will resize video to see the events more clearly, but what they may not be aware of is that that resizing event can actually affect the image and can change the interpretation of that image in certain scenarios, depending on the interpolation method that is used. It's that word that you used, interpolation.
Mm-hmm.
So the way that I like to describe this, and in fact, I after watching the trial, it was cool to see one of the, we'll probably talk about this in a moment, but the defense expert on the case, Dr. John Black, was using Input Ace, our software, on the stand in a very, very well done testimony. And he had pulled some of the training content that we use that's freely available on YouTube about resizing and what that means. And the defense counsel had used that actually while speaking to one of the prosecution experts. So it's kind of cool to see our training material used in that case that way.
Is that the one that is that the YouTube one that's aspect ratio, resizing, and interpolation?
Yes, yeah, this one right here that's actually on the can pinch to zoom alter video evidence link.
Okay, yeah, great. I'll provide that link to the audience here. Here we go.
Great. And I just pulled this up because I think that's an easy way to describe this. The theoretical kind of image that I put forward in this training session is, imagine you have an image, simplified image that is 3 red pixels and 3 blue pixels in a 3x2 image. If we then resize that to a 3x3 image, we cannot get any extra data out of a single pixel, because a single pixel is nothing more than a single square solid color value. So there's no extra data there, right? If I have a license plate that's 1 pixel in the image, there's no enhancement technique in the planet that can do anything with that because it's 1 pixel.
Right.
It's why enhancements are really rare at that level, right? When we look at requests that come in all the time that show images that there's just nothing you can do about it because there's no data there. But when you resize, you inherently have to add extra pixels. You can't get this red pixel to become anything else other than a red square pixel. So when I resize this to a 3x3 image, I'm inherently making new pixels. And what the interpolation method does is define what color value is going to go into those new pixels that we're creating. And different interpolation methods will do different things to the image. So I pulled up Photoshop, which we have the same feature with an Input Ace, but it was a good example to do this right in Photoshop, where, for example, nearest neighbor resizing is going to only use the color palette that's available in the original image, and those unknown new pixels will be colored with the exact same color as its nearest neighboring pixel. So in this case, in a 3x2 image, red and blue, a nearest neighbor resizing is going to create a middle row of blue pixels, which now we've got double the blue than we do the red, and the image is no longer an appropriate shape relative to the original, right? We've lost that continuity between half red and half blue. We've now got double the blues that were the red. But if I were to resize that image up by, ×2, rather than this like odd increment, if I go up ×2, what was a 3x2 red and blue, going up by a multiple of 2 is now going to bump that up to a doubled sized image. It's a perfect replica of the original. It can be reverted. We can go back to the original and forward by changing it, because it's effectively we can call it almost like lossless transition, because we can go back to the original. So when you're doubling, tripling, quadrupling the size of an image, and we want to address forensic questions about it, like what the DVR recorded, especially for doing things like height measurements and assessing what color shoelaces the person had on their shoes, those kinds of things are really important, that we are using something like nearest neighbor and resizing in those kinds of increments, because other interpolation methods like bicubic and bilinear will round out and add new colors that are the average effectively of neighboring pixel regions. So right. In this case, it's making purple and other colors.
So I think it's written on the page there, but a good question is, how do you decide which one you should use for what purpose?
Yeah, so that's the summary and the general statement that I would make is in forensic questions, shape, color, not so much shape, I should clarify, color, size, that kind of thing. I'm going to be using nearest neighbor every time. And I'm going to make sure that I'm resizing in, double, triple, quadruple,
right.
even increments. If I'm doing an aspect ratio correction because the shapes are incorrect and I'm trying to correct for making proper shapes, I'll typically use bilinear. It's going to be a smoothing process, but it's not as dramatic as something like bicubic. And bicubic is going to make things very pretty. It's going to make them much more rounded and much more, it's a much larger effect on the image. But bicubic is something that does create very nice, pretty pictures. So if I'm zooming into the background to watch somebody get out of their vehicle and go walk inside, and I'm not saying anything about how fast they're going or what the distances they're traveling or how tall they are or what color their backpack is, if all I'm doing is saying individual gets out of vehicle and goes into the 7-Eleven, I'll typically be using bicubic because it makes a nice, prettier picture that's easier for the jury to look at. And I'm not making any forensic statements other than of a person moving out of the vehicle and going
like a demonstrative, like
exactly.
Okay.
So it's fit for demonstratives.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, but definitely nearest neighbor. If you're doing some type of analysis, then you would stick with nearest neighbor. That seems to be the go-to for analysis.
Right. Yeah, I agreed. And again, it depends on the scenario specifically. There are scenarios where we would use other interpolation methods, but there's also more than these three. There's dozens of interpolation methods out there.
Okay, so let's go to the let's move this into the Rittenhouse now. I mean, this one was we're sort of getting there. What was the main sticking point in that particular trial that caused some concern?
Yeah, there were a few things that had occurred, and we're going to be having our symposium coming up here in March, I believe, where Dr. Black will be speaking about his experience there. So he'll be a much better person to give you a deep dive into the nuances of everything that occurred both on and off the stand.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't involved in the case, just to be clear. I have not reviewed the original videos other than what's been presented by the media. So what I'm going to be able to speak to is a bit more minimal than he can. But to my knowledge, what occurred was a few things. One of which was there were two experts on the case that had used video that were walking the jury through the events. And Dr. Black was using Input Ace with all of his video kind of aligned in real time. He was like snapping around kind of live on the stand through the whole all of his exhibits. But the other expert was challenged on a few things, one of which was what interpolation method he'd used when he had zoomed into the video. And it's really important in the forensic video world or any video evidence world that whatever we do to the video on its way from the point that it hits our desk to the time that it's being presented to the jury, mm-hmm. that we have an accurate replica and a report of what we have done to the video. As one example here, within Input Ace, if I have a video file that I'll just throw a clip in here. If I have a video file that I'm going through and I'm resizing the video, in my settings, am choosing explicitly which interpolation method I'm going to pick, and I'm deciding what size to resize to. Mm-hmm. I might then, crop it or do any other number of filters that I'm kind of chaining together here. And then at the end, when I write that out to a standard like MP4 file, this workflow is something that I will always want to save as part of my case notes. Just save, and it can be exported and stored with that. That's important for a number of reasons. One of which is in the States, we follow typically Daubert and Frye standards. In Canada, it's Mohan, but they obviously mm-hmm. reference Daubert as well. And one of the things that's really important is that we can replicate our work and that it can be then peer-reviewed and also performed by other experts.
Yeah.
So one of the issues is in that case was being able to speak to which method was performed just for the sake of reproducibility. The other is that depending on the specific interpolation method that was used, there could have been differences in the perception of the weapon that was visible in the background, which direction it was pointed in, if it was pointed at all. And a good example of that is this case right here that we talk about in this same blog post. I won't go through all the details because I know we're probably further beyond where we wanted to be here on this this chat. But this case involves an individual who's running away from the police, and the police shoot him. And one of the questions was the weapon, a gun, visible in the right hand of the individual when the officers fired? And when you look at the video and you resize it by nearest neighbor, I mean, this is the original video right here. You can't see much at all, right? So we would want to resize that to get a better perspective of what is happening in the area of his hand. And if we resize with nearest neighbor, we get this, right? Which is a few pixels in and around the area of his hand. And as a forensic expert, what I would say is we can't know what was in his hand. Could there have been a gun? Yes. Could there have been not a gun? Yes. Could it have been just his hand? Yes. There's not enough resolution to know. But when another expert had resized that with bicubic, it ended up giving a rounded out perspective that there's a shape of a gun right there. And that was then used to assert that there was therefore a gun in his hand. And then, XYZ occurs. And it's really important for us to not make forensic statements about things that we have effectively fabricated ourselves through the process of resizing. And that effectively is the question that was coming up in this trial is what method was used and can it be replicated? And was it fit for the purpose of assessing whether there was a gun pointed in a particular direction?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, I've seen this before that, when we talk about forensic video analysis, you're trying to find whether or not a video is fit for purpose. So can we just, if you can talk about that just very briefly, what do you mean when you say, is something fit for purpose?
Yeah, especially with video, a given video may be fit for one purpose and not fit for another. For example, I might have a video that is a variable frame rate. So I play the file and the timing between images is variable. It's a very common thing. So between image 1 and image 2 is a tenth of a second. Between image 2 and 3 is 2 seconds. Mm-hmm. 3 and 4 is something else. So in a situation like that, if I don't have access to validated metadata that I can prove and confirm is accurate, then that video is not fit for the purpose of doing something like a speed calculation. I can't confirm exactly how much time passes between the images if the metadata doesn't exist and we can't validate it. So therefore, that video, I can't count the number of frames and apply a frame rate and get an accurate speed. Mm-hmm. It's actually very, very common that video files are like that. And we run into scenarios where people do calculate speed. It's a whole nother topic for, I guess, another time. But
yeah,
yeah. A file like that is not fit for the purpose of speed, but it might be fit for the purpose of doing a height measurement, right?
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, we've been talking. You sort of leading into the different trials and things like that. So I'm curious about your experiences and what you've what you've experienced at trial in terms of what kinds of things will the defense or prosecution raise in voir dire, for example. So let's start with the expert before we talk about the evidence. So what kinds of things do they typically ask you about in terms of your expertise, your background, and all that stuff?
Yeah, it definitely depends on the case. Some cases will be very aggressive during the voir dire process. I actually had a case myself that was aggressively challenged, partly because there was a previous trial that had occurred a couple of years prior to that, where a judge came out with a very negative ruling about forensic video evidence in general. It was a very, quite frankly, kind of, I was surprised when I read it how kind of over the top it was. But anyway, because of the judge's ruling in that case, in this case that I was testifying in, which was actually in Alberta, the defense counsel filed a motion to dismiss my evidence about 30 minutes before I was scheduled to testify. And I flew up to Grand Prairie expecting to be there for about a day. And I had no awareness of this until I was on the stand. But what the defense was doing in that case was basically using a point-by-point guide from that previous case to try and get the video evidence dismissed, or at least get my evidence dismissed. Mm-hmm. And so what was supposed to be about a day of trial turned into about 3 days of voir dire and about a day and a half of testimony. It was a pretty aggressive, interesting case.
Hate when that happens.
Yeah. Okay.
In terms of your in terms of training and background, like, I mean, obviously there are options available for people now, like Leva. You mentioned Leva as well, and then also like you know, if you're using a piece of software, like in your case, Input Ace, or if there's other software out there like AMP, whatever, it's got to be really important to get training from the actual software company and things like that, just so you are proficient or have some kind of a certification in different areas. Obviously, like anything, the more training you have, the better it is, right? So that's an important point, I think. In terms of the actual evidence and the process and stuff like that, I mean, were there good questions being? I mean, were there the good questions being asked, or were they sort of, I don't know, unnecessary? They're just kind of, you know, reaching or fishing for something to try and get your testimony excluded.
It's a bit of both, right? Sometimes testimony can be a bit of a game, and it's important for us as experts to know the purpose behind the questions that are being asked. I see this a lot of times where someone will go to testify who may have done a great job on their actual work, but because they don't have either the confidence testifying or they don't have the awareness of the case law behind some of the reasons for the questions, they can get themselves into some corners that are really negative outcomes, potentially unjustified negative outcomes, but they led themselves down a path. So a good example, you talked about training. I mean, this is the classes that we teach. We have our certification programs for our software, which is multiple different certification paths and training courses. One of them is called the investigator course, which is basically the class that someone would take when they don't even have our software or they don't care to become video experts, but they want to learn more about the pitfalls of using video in an investigative process.
Mm-hmm.
And in that class, we talk about these kinds of things quite a bit, the pitfalls that can arise when testifying. In my case, I'll give you a quick example of one of the things that was asked. So this is more of a service level kind of easy question, but here's an example. Mr. Fredericks, when you're coming to your opinion in this case, is it true that you're looking at your computer monitor and observing the images to make your opinion? Now, if we pause for a second, that's a question that has a very obvious answer, right? Like, of course, yes, I'm looking at the computer monitor to do what I'm doing in order to make my opinion. But answering yes to that question could have led to a very significant pitfall. Because in the case law, and in Mohan specifically is what the one that he was alluding to there is a statement that the expertise is required and is necessary in order for the trier fact to understand the evidence. So what does it mean for the evidence to be necessary, or the expertise to be necessary for the trier fact to understand? Well, what would have happened is if I had said yes to that question and left it at one word, yes, and moved on, later on, a few hours later, when I'm out of the courtroom, what the defense counsel would have done is gone to the judge, which in Canada is my lord, and in the States is your honor.
Your honor.
So for the U.S. people on here, it's my lord is the terminology you want to put on if you ever go over the border. But they would say, my lord, you heard yourself that Mr. Fredericks testified that all he's doing is looking at his computer monitor. So therefore, you don't need him. You can look at the monitor yourself and make up your own mind about what's going on. We don't need this expert to tell us what you can clearly see with your own eyes. So that is the purpose behind the question. And when you're on the stand, there's this juggling game of ensuring that the trier fact gets factual, honest answers that help them understand the nuances of the video. And there's also the side of ensuring that those factual answers are done in such a way that doesn't lead to unnecessary and inaccurate challenges.
Right.
Like if I had said, yes, that's accurate, but it's not going to help the trier fact because they're then going to get an argument that is not really appropriate. So instead, what I would say to that, and what I did say to that is, oh, I'm doing a lot more than just looking at my monitor. And then they have to ask a follow-up question. And then I can now talk about the way the compression works and why, with software, we can observe how compression affects the images and to ensure that what I'm presenting is accurate and yada, yada. So that's the never wanting to say a yes to an answer unless we really know for sure that it's a definitive.
Yeah. Did I understand correctly? So when you're talking about Dr. John Black being on the stand, Did he have input ace up on the stand and yourself as well? Like it's an interesting point because in the past, I remember from years back, people would provide PDFs, exported videos, and stuff like that. But it's interesting as an expert now, if you're there and you're bringing up the actual software that you're using and say, hey, let me show you what I'm doing here, and they can see it firsthand. I think that's a very powerful point when you can demonstrate to a jury or a judge, whatever, exactly what it is that you're doing. Is that something you are now attempting to do or teaching people to do more of?
Absolutely. Yeah, we go over this in our classes. And Dr. Black did a fantastic job of doing exactly what we teach. I'll show a quick thing here to kind of give a very high level example of this. So I just loaded a project. This is actually the exact data that I brought with me on the stand when I testified on that case. The reason for it is with input ace, I have controls to do things like snap to a particular marked frame of video. I can search for it. So if I had a case where, I wanted to go find the moment in time where I said the word, gun, or, a certain individual's name, I can type that out and can immediately filter my file list down to just the items that have that. I guess this case doesn't have the word gun in it, but you can see the point. Like if I had sometimes hundreds of markers and clips, it's a way to quickly snap to those points. In this case, if I play the video here, we can see the moment in time that the muzzle flashes occur. And I now have controls to forward and backward in the video to zoom in, ensuring that I'm zooming in with appropriate interpolation methods because I can adjust that. And so what I'll often do for the judge is make a little clip and then loop it. And these types of controls to quickly snap to the video to loop things is really powerful. And what I find, and I know every expert that uses the technology will find, is that when going through cross-examination, oftentimes whether it's defense or prosecution that's crossing, they often don't want certain things to be shown because it's going to be, in the case of a defense, it's going to be negative for their client. So if there's a moment in time where I can clearly see something like an individual, removing something from their waist, which is what occurred in this particular case. I'm not going to hunt for it too hard if I can't find it right away. But it was something that I would then put up and loop, and the defense might raise a question to say, when you showed this thing, is it possible that you misinterpreted what was going on or something like that? What I can then very quickly do is snap back to that point in time and begin looping it for the judge. And very quickly, the defense counsel is not necessarily going to want that to stay on screen because they'll see that as something that could lead to the jury or the judge better understanding the nature of the evidence.
I was just thinking, like from a training perspective, like this would be an interesting exercise for you to do in your training courses if you don't already. But have somebody up on a stand with input ace and say, okay, I'd like to see clip this, that. Could you bring up that clip again? Could you loop it again and see how quickly they can react? Because this is like, for example, myself, I'm doing the 3D stuff and that sort of thing. I will often bring 3D Studio Max or whatever software on the stand because I'm often asked, hey, could you move to this angle or could you go to this perspective or could you measure this distance? So you have to obviously be comfortable with the software, right? Like you don't want to be fumbling through it because then it has the reverse sort of effect. But I think this is a really, really interesting point that I hadn't thought about before. So yeah, if people are getting comfortable with input ace as a software package, it's a very, very powerful tool on stand.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's I use it for a lot, but I would argue that that's probably the most powerful thing that I can do beyond just the basics of being a place to organize your data in real time and track events from multiple camera angles, being able to keep those organized events. And of course, working with, in the case of, for example, if you're working with prosecution, if they understand this and they know, and this is what happened in this case, I explained to them what I believe would be a clear, organized way to walk the judge through the evidence when he's seeing it for the first time. And so it's all organized in my file list this way so that as I'm going through item point by point, the prosecutor who has the visibility into this knows that, okay, we just talked about that. The next clip that we're going to talk about is this, and we just walk through it, and it really guides the direct evidence and then is there present for any cross-examination that occurs. So it's a really helpful way to organize and kind of keep the dialogue consistent and doesn't. I've had the experience before input ace when I testified without it. I've had the experience where the prosecution was kind of bouncing around a lot, walking through direct, and I've found that ever since Input Ace came to be, then I've used this, that it really leads to much more organized direct evidence.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, we could have had a whole talk just on Input Ace here, but
for sure.
I'd like to know just what was the spark that went off for you that said, you know what, I got to make a tool here, or I got to do something. I was at some of the early conferences where you hinted at it and talked about it and I saw some stuff coming together. So it's been nice from my perspective to sort of see how this has grown. But for you, what was the thing that made you go, we need this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think if I were to backdate everything back to about 2011, when I was early in the field and was dealing with the primary challenge that every investigator deals with, which is this issue of having thousands of proprietary formats that they're collecting. Back in the old days, what we were stuck doing was finding a proprietary player, which we now know a lot more about how faulty those can be because we have a better method. But we would find these proprietary players, play them, screen record in real time, and it would take hours and hours and hours to get access to the video to properly do anything with it. Mm-hmm. So while doing that work, the Vancouver riots occurred after the Canucks lost the Stanley Cup. And the downtown city of Vancouver was erupted in pretty violent riots. And that led to about 8,000 hours of video being recorded from a number of different sources. And to get all that evidence into a single platform required about 55 video analysts who were flown in from mostly North America, but from even Europe. And were processing it around the clock in 8-hour shifts for 55 people. And it took like a week to get through that. There had to be a better way. And as we started to learn more about the underlying technologies of video playback, I built what was initially a very lightweight kind of beta version of what then became Input Ace, and was using it as a training tool to teach people some of these techniques, and realized that there was a pretty big interest and market out there. So we put a lot more resources into it and kind of dove in head first, and it's been just growing ever since.
Right. So what would you say is like the strongest point of Input Ace? Like what, if you had to say, look, you do the elevator pitch, right? Like you got the 30 seconds in the elevator and you're like, look, this is why it's important. This is why you need it. What would you say there?
I think it depends on who's asking the question. If it's an investigator, simply drag, drop, play your video in a forensically sound environment, organize stuff in real time, tag your images, you're marking frames of video, and you can put all the metadata on them. Being able to save and reload that. So that right there is the biggest investigative value. In the forensic world, then there's all the other demonstrative exhibits we can create and enhancements, and then in the measurement world, in the 3D world, we have specialized tools for integrating video evidence into 3D point clouds and calculating timing. So I think it really depends on who's asking the question. But at a foundation, being a forensic application that can be used by investigators because of its simplicity, I think that's really the protecting of investigators by giving them access to the original data in its original format and protecting them from doing too much with it, and then giving forensic experts to do the more advanced stuff is really where we put our focus.
Right. Let me ask you a question. I just got a couple more questions, and I'm going to address some of the questions in the comments here. But there was just an update that was released from Input Ace, and it had a couple of cool features in there. There was something in the background that actually you mentioned to me the other day, and I thought that was pretty cool. But can you talk about where Input Ace currently is, and what are the future plans, if any, that you can discuss about where you want to see this going?
Yeah, there's some exciting things that are coming in 2022 that I'm going to have to keep a bit of a lid on for a bit. So I apologize to the audience, but if we can talk again in a couple months, I'll lift that up a little bit more. But we've got some really exciting things that are coming up the pipe. We, as a development team, are cranking out new formats every release and adding new exciting features in most releases. In just the last one, we added a bunch of dynamic on-screen text. So when you're burning on date, time, and picture types and frame counts, that kind of thing. This feature, while basic in its appearance initially, is one that actually has a lot more to it. We are decoding proprietary video file formats as their raw, like native binary structures, which means that not only we're getting access to the most forensically sound, accurate information, we also are getting a lot of metadata out of that. And so when we get metadata down to the frame level for when the frame was purported to be recorded for a date time, for example, we were able to ensure that that data is played back at that same proper speed, which is not something that has existed before. So having two proprietary video files from two different systems, and then being able to drag and drop them into Input Ace, push a single button, and already have them aligned in real time, even if they're variable frame rates, is a really, really exciting thing for us.
Yeah, nice. There's actually a question here. Let me bring it up here. So it's a good dog, and he's got a gorilla or something in his picture, but it's actually Matt, and I don't know what Matt's last name is, but he asked about all the different proprietary codecs. And you mentioned sort of at the beginning that there's all these different manufacturers, and they've got all their own way of doing things, whatever. So Input Ace has to be able to read all. I mean, is it just brute force? Is there any intelligence in there? Like, how are you handling all these different codecs?
Yeah, so I love this question because it highlights a couple of things, and one of them is something that that I'm gonna put on my little my nerd hat for a second and go a bit deep into, not too deep, but into explaining the difference between something. So it's a really common expectation that the video files that we are encountering in the investigative world have proprietary codecs. And they typically actually don't these days. That it's a term that has continued to be used, even though in the majority of scenarios now, vast majority of scenarios now, the codecs are actually standardized codecs. The format, though, of them is what's proprietary and unique. So some manufacturers will do something like they will say, all right, if the binary pattern was supposed to be this for a standard, H.264 codec, we're going to take every third bit and flip it, or we're going to reverse the structure of it, or we're going to flip every nth bit. It is a number of different kind of techniques that these manufacturers use to obfuscate their data. Some of them just simply put metadata structures in that cause the decoders to not understand them. So what might look like a proprietary codec is really a standard codec oftentimes that just has a proprietary structure to it. So what we are doing is basically developing the answer to these various puzzles. And then when we go and develop a new decoder, the decoder is taking those binary patterns and effectively fixing them so that we can then read it with a standardized codec like H.264 in most cases. So our library is ever growing. We have a pretty cool developer tool that we've, that actually, I think we're hearing back from the patent office again this week on, but it is a technique that allows people that don't even have training in software development. They can be, we've trained people that have degrees in psychology, can come in, learn how to use this tool that we built, and it allows them to basically see the binary data in a new way and then apply these puzzles and then spit decoders out. So we're oftentimes turning decoders around in an hour or a day when a customer calls us with a support request.
That's great. That's amazing. Yeah, it's great stuff, being able to support that many kinds of requests. Because I know it's happened to me too, where something's kind of weird or whatever, and I'm pretty sure I've sent you something, and then the next day I'm like, oh, okay, they cracked that nut already. So that's great. Yeah. Last question here, and that has to do with how people can either contact you or find out more. And are you? I think you're on. Well, you are on LinkedIn, right? So people can always search you up on LinkedIn, and there's also the website. I'll bring the website up, but any other? Just people go through the contact form online, or what's the best way to reach you?
Yeah, that's the best way. LinkedIn, our website. Obviously, my email address is just andrew@inputace.com. For me personally, I think that people that are looking at this from a perspective of either someone who's already a trained expert and wants to get additional training, or someone who's brand new in the field, our training page on our website has both on-demand and live training opportunities, from the investigator class all the way through to the examiner level. So that's where I'd look for that kind of thing.
Excellent. Well, Andrew, look, I just want to say thanks so much. You've always been a great technical resource, very, very knowledgeable. And yeah, I just always appreciate all the stuff that you're doing in the community and information symposiums and everything else. Oh, and mention your symposium again, just so people know about it.
Yeah, in fact, I think we just announced it this week. So it is their third annual symposium. You'll be hearing from, it's a week long or close to a week long, from a bunch of experts in the field. And it should be coming. I want to say it's the end of March, but it's on our website, so you should be able to see it from there.
Excellent. All right. Hey, listen, hang back. I'm just going to close out here, but hey, we'll thank you again. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Eugene. As always, I look forward to the next time we can catch up in person.
Awesome. All right, folks. Well, that does it for this one. Some really great information there from Andrew. He does a really, really great job, a really great resource. If you want to know about video analysis, if you're looking at some good tools, then you know, he's someone to really catch up on. And I think his software is a necessary tool for a lot of people who are going to be working with video. Don't forget, just the other two announcements that I had at the beginning was the iafsm.org. So don't forget about that coming up in February. And of course, even earlier than that, the Forensic Photography Symposium, January 17th to 20th. You can just head over to the website, and on there, the registration is open, the schedule's there, the speakers are there. There's a whole bunch of different information. So, hey, thank you everybody for the questions, for paying attention here and everything else. Very informative session here. And we are going to see you next time on Click 3D. There may be a little bit of a break until the next one. We're going to have to see, but I'm going to try and squeeze in another one. So on that note, everyone, hey, have a great day, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.